Welcome, one and all, to episode 1 of Moby-Dick Abridged, or Who Cares What Eli Thinks About Moby-Dick. This episode covers Chapter 1 of Moby-Dick, Loomings. I, as before, am your host, Eli, who cares what I think, and I am rootin' tootin' ready to raise and rope broncos. Which is how I've chosen to say I'm ready to start. Are you? Good. Most of you probably already know that the opening line of Moby-Dick, which, as we discussed in the last episode, isn't actually the opening line at all, and even though most people just skip the etymology and extract section when they read the book, especially for the first time, you should really go back and check out episode 0 before getting into this one. Anyway, the opening line is incredibly famous. "Call me Ishmael," the narrator instructs us. It's a wild opening line. I think it's so famous because it's a quite stylish introduction, but what makes it so cool to me after several readings of Moby Dick is that he doesn't actually tell us his name. He gives us an alias, like we're in some kind of shady back alley arms deal or something. Then he doubles down on it. "Some years ago," he goes on, "never mind how long precisely." The first several pieces of information we get from our narrator are, by his own admission, and to be very charitable, less than forthcoming. For clarity's sake, we'll call him Ishmael, but it raises a really interesting question, and we're only halfway through the second sentence. Who is the narrator, really? Off the bat, let's go ahead and try to rephrase that, recontextualize that question a little bit. Who is the narrator in a meta-narrative sense? As in, who are we, the reader, supposed to identify as the narrator, if anyone? In Moby Dick, we do have a narrator who identifies themselves as Ishmael, though, as we just mentioned, somewhat less than directly. To reiterate, they don't say "I'm Ishmael" or "my name is Ishmael" or anything concrete like that. I guess it could have just been some super swagged out way to start off the novel, and that's it. Nothing deeper. But as we continue even just this first chapter, I think you'll come to agree with me that Melville doesn't really do things unintentionally in his writing. He chose not to directly identify his narrator. Perhaps this is a wink to the reader and a sly admission of a self-insert. I kind of think that, in a sense, all art is autobiography, so I guess that could really apply to any character in any book to some degree or other, right? Now, I really think Melville is trying to send us a subtle message in the subtext of this opening, especially because of the follow-up. If it was just the first line, then yeah, swagged out opening is probably right. But he's all wishy-washy about how long it's been, too. And again, this line, too, could easily be dismissed as just styly. But let's think about it again. Some years ago, never mind how long precisely. He could have just said, "some years ago," and moved on, and I'd think nothing of it. But then he adds, "never mind how long precisely," as if it is really to drive home that he's withholding something. Maybe not withholding exactly, but there's some things that he's going to tell us, and there's some things that he's going to leave out. Shit that's need to know. And we really don't need to know it, you know? That's just Ishmael's style. Anyway, I kind of think he's comparing himself to Ishmael in a way, more than saying that that's his name. You feel me? Remember from the previous episode how Melville intentionally elevated the rhetorical pitch of the novel to that of the Bible? Well, in some sense, I think that this is one of the ways that choice is expressed. In the introduction to one of my copies of Moby Dick, Carl F. Hoved says this about Ishmael. "The borrowed name lets us know that he will tell us only what he wants to, and that he is a man apart from his fellows. The biblical Ishmael is the illegitimate son of Abraham and Sarah's servant Hagar. And even though the Lord is good to Ishmael later in Genesis, his half-brother Isaac inherits the Lord's covenant through their father." So I guess Ishmael, in Moby Dick, not in the Bible, is kind of letting us know that he's a little emo. Ishmael's story kind of sucks, right? He's a bastard, and that's not his fault. In fact, he was conceived because Abraham's wife, Sarah, thought that she was unable to have children. And later, Sarah does end up having a son named Isaac, who will go on to have a son named Jacob, or Israel. Sound familiar? And as we know, Israel was the chosen nation of the chosen people of God. So at some point or other, Hagar and Ishmael end up getting banished, and they make their way over to Arabia, where, according to Islamic tradition, eventually the Prophet Muhammad would be born as a male line descendant of Ishmael. So it's like Hoved said, there's like a bit of a rough patch for Ishmael in there, but he's okay in the end. And as we'll see, he has a bit of a penchant for melodrama, but really, things could have gone a lot worse for him. In any case, his name isn't the only interesting thing about Ishmael or the way he narrates. In the beginning of the story, Ishmael is a pretty standard narrator, but once we get onto the ship, which is called the Pequod, by the way, he starts narrating things that he couldn't possibly have witnessed, all the way to the inner thoughts of some of the crew, or what Ahab and the mates are discussing in their private dinners in the captain's cabin. In some cases, we phase completely out of prose and find ourselves in a short little play. The point I'm really trying to make here is that there's much more to Ishmael than meets the eye, and we'll do well to remember that moving forward. So yeah, Ishmael introduces himself to us and tells us that some amount of time ago he was broke and had shit going on for him, so like he always does when he gets to feeling this type of way, he's headed to sea. It's his way of driving off the spleen and regulating the circulation. Whenever he finds himself in a grim mood, whenever he can't seem to stop himself from stopping and staring into the windows of coffin warehouses or involuntarily following every funeral he sees, whenever he wants to step out in front of a horse-drawn carriage or go around getting into fights knocking off people's hats, he heads out to sea. This is my substitute for pistol and ball, he tells us. Really showing that emo streak there. I mean, he's gonna kill himself if he can't get to sea. And before you go thinking he's some fucking weird ocean-obsessed freak, he points out that everyone, to some degree or other, at some time or other, has felt pretty much exactly the same way. Here, and by here I mean in paragraph 2, the tone shifts considerably into this cool sort of conversational guided tour. Ishmael is directly instructing you, the reader, which I'm pretty sure is like at least flirting with second person narration. Correct me in the comments if I'm wrong. And for a little bit, he's like basically telling us to imagine what he describes, which is kind of strange, obviously, from a meta narrative point of view, since that's like already what a book is, if you think about it. So by purposefully bringing attention to that, it kind of creates this like strong sense of intimacy with the reader. I don't know. It's kind of like having like an out of body experience, like within the meta book world, I guess. Not only that, but it's like he's sort of found like a back door into our trust, which is like doubly helpful after his less than like totally honest opening lines. But yeah, so back to the point. And just a little break of the fourth wall here. There's a neighborhood. There's a guy in my neighborhood, running like his weed whacker or his lawnmower or some shit. I don't know. I think he's done, but he might just be lulling me into a false sense of security about it. And then he's going to just fuck me up the tailpipe. Good old vulgarized liar joke. But yeah, so I'm gonna do my absolute best to get rid of any lawn maintenance sound artifacts that there might be in the recording, but I might miss some, and it may prove impossible. So I'm sorry about that up front. But as we were saying, back to Moby-Dick Abridged. By imploring the reader to look, to follow, to come along, he Melville, not the fucking lawn artist, Ishmael, really, not Melville, involves us in the action. He embodies us and positions himself in front of us as our guide or our shepherd, if you will. By employing this unconventional, direct, conversational tone and taking us on a guided tour, really, he forces us to rely on him. It's fucking brilliant and creates such a cool effect. So, anyway, he takes us around Manhattan. Keep in mind that this book is older than the Civil War, so things have probably changed a lot. Nor is this chapter intended to be like Ulysses is to Dublin, where James Joyce supposedly wanted people to be able to like reconstruct the city if it were like ever wiped from the face of the earth by like reading his book. So like not that level of detail in this tour, but anyway, he points out that like Manhattan is an island, obviously, and therefore surrounded by water and is therefore prosperous. So there's that element to like the sea and like what makes the sea so special. Right and left, he tells us the streets take you waterward, which yeah, it's kind of cool, but kind of also, duh, it's a fucking island. We just established that, but whatever. If you go downtown to the Battery, which I'm pretty sure that is a place still in Manhattan from playing the old Spider-Man games, and that's the only reason I know that. If you go downtown to the Battery, you'll see just fucking whole crowds out there just looking at the sea, you know, and this point, he's like practically like taunting us in tone. He's like, circumambulate the city of a dreamy Sabbath afternoon. What do you see? What do you think you see, dear viewer? That's right. Fucking water watchers. And you know, he's kind of got a point. You know, who hasn't gone to a beach and just sort of looked out at the water? Doesn't have to be the ocean. Doesn't even have to stretch out beyond the horizon. I don't know. Maybe it's because life like started in the sea. Maybe that's why there's something sort of like special, meditative, and like restorative about just standing in the presence of the ocean and the like the water and contemplating its vastness, you know? Maybe, I don't know. Who the fuck knows? Whatever the reason is, ISHMAEL's like, here we've got a ton of people out by the edge of the water, but what's really important is that these are all landsmen of weekdays, pent up in lath and plaster, tied to counters, nailed to benches, clinched to desks. How then is this? Are the green fields gone? What do they here? And that's like an old-timey way of saying, like, what do they do here? But he, like, flips it around in that, like, Shakespearean way where, like, you put the verb before who does it. I don't know. But you know what I'm saying? It's kind of like flip backwards. Anyways, what do they here? It's like a good old-timey style of talking. And he's sort of, like, making the point with, like, all of those verbs. And you'll kind of learn that I'm, like, heavily into Melville's use of verbs, that being behind counters and on benches and behind desks is an unnatural state for men or a woman, mankind, you know, humans. And they must be restrained or else they'd naturally flow river-like to the sea. Or at least to some open green field, if not that, to some place free. And I think that really is at least one of the principal ideas represented in this book by the sea. Yeah, freedom. Wow. Just fucking super original to associate the sea with freedom. A+, Herman. But hey, how else do you explain those poor fuckers clinched to their desks for fear of floating off something actually worth doing? Maybe he's got a point. But still, those who are lucky enough to have the ability to flock to the very edge of the water, getting as close as they can without falling in, he tells us. And he goes on and on and on and says a lot of beautiful shit about how the sea calls to us and how we hold it in high reverence. He points out that Poseidon rules over the sea, separate from Zeus and his own brother to boot. It's actually not a bad point. I mean, think about it. You've got Zeus, Hades, and Poseidon, right? Hades is in charge of the world of the dead, like the afterlife, right? Zeus is in charge of this world. And then Poseidon is in charge of the sea. And that's it. Not to like diminish it. Not that that's not a lot, but I mean like the sea is put on the same level as like the universe of the living in that cosmology. Pretty hefty, you know? It's kind of cool. Anyway, now we need to get something straight here. Whenever ISHMAEL starts to feel puny, whenever he gets hazy about the eyes or overconscious of his lungs, he goes to sea. Yeah, He's not like chartering a relaxing and leisurely voyage to exotic romantic ports of call as a passenger, though. And while he seems almost to look down on these tourists at sea, he admits that what keeps him from their ranks is really just a lack of money. So I guess we'll make of that whatever we want. Conversely, while he never goes to sea as a passenger, nor does he come a ship as a commodore or a captain or a cook, instead abandoning the glory and distinction of such offices to those who like them. I'm not sure if he means glory and distinction or those offices, but that's kind of an interesting little double entendre there. And ensuring us that, for my part, I abominate all honorable, respectable toils, trials, and tribulations of every kind whatsoever. In spite of abhorring of honest work, ISHMAEL tells us that he has grown used to the sorts of tasks a sailor must perform in his previous excursions at sea. Taking orders and doing undesirable work is just sort of the thing that's required. And yeah, it stings a little at first being ordered around, but before you wrinkle your nose in pity for poor old ISHMAEL, just when you least expect him to, he drops this little gem on us and puts it all into perspective in one of my very favorite passages in the whole book, actually. What of it if some old hunks of a sea captain orders me to get a broom and sweep down the decks? What does that indignity amount to? Weighed, I mean, in the scales of the New Testament. Do you think the Archangel Gabriel thinks anything less of me because I promptly and respectfully obey that old hunks in that particular instance? Who ain't a slave? Tell me that. Well then, however the old sea captains may order me about, however they may thump me and punch me about, I have the satisfaction of knowing that it is all right. That everyone else, in one way or other, served in much the same way. Either in a physical or a metaphysical point of view, that is. And so the universal thump is passed round, and all hands should rub each other's shoulder blades and be content. Who ain't a slave? Man, that line hits me in the heart. Very Bob Dylan, you know? You got to serve somebody. Hard to argue with at the end of the day. And almost as if to drive this point home, ISHMAEL gives another baser reason for wanting to go to sea as a sailor. Because they make a point of paying me for my trouble, whereas they never pay passengers a single penny that I ever heard of. On the contrary, passengers themselves must pay. And there's all the difference in the world between paying and being paid. The act of paying is perhaps the most uncomfortable infliction that the two orchard thieves, those being Adam and Eve, who stole the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and that is definitely a mouthful. Get it? You know, fruit, you know, because of the Bible, ever entailed upon us, but being paid, what will compare with it? The urbane activity with which a man receives money is really marvelous, considering that we so earnestly believe money to be the root of all earthly ills, and that on no account can a moneyed man enter heaven. Ah, how cheerfully we consign ourselves to perdition. There's a little bit of that quote in there that gives me such powerful Half-Life 2 G-Man vibes. It's fucking uncanny. Can't you just imagine him saying this in his creepy fucking way of speaking? And there is all the difference in the world between paying and being paid. Wake up and smell the ashes. Are you feeling spookered yet? That was all right, G-Man, I think. Let's hear your fucking G-Man impression anyway. If you are feeling spookered, fret not, because old ISHMAEL, old Papa Ishy, old ISHMAEL has one last paragraph of reasoning if you're still not sure why he wants to go to sea. And then as a sailor. And this is one that's a little more lighthearted, you know? In fact, much like Hakuna Matata from The Lion King, which is just a big fart joke wrapped in a inspiring and valuable life lesson, we get what has to be one of the most dignified and intellectual fart jokes ever in this paragraph. Finally, ISHMAEL tells us, I always go to sea as a sailor, because of the wholesome exercise and pure air of the forecastle deck. For as in this world headwinds are far more prevalent than winds from astern, that is, if you never violate the Pythagorean maxim. First of all, an explanation. If you're not familiar with sailing jargon, which why would you be unless you're like the trust fund baby? I don't know. Maybe you grew up by the sea. I don't know. Maybe. I shouldn't judge. Anyway, the stern is the back of the ship, the rear of the ship. And the Pythagorean maxim he refers to is Pythagoras' prohibition against the fava bean, which apparently he thought caused gas, which I guess is true, right? That's what they say of beans. They're well known for that quality that they possess. But they caused gas, which robbed the flatulent one of the very breath of life. Probably just got sick of feeling like he was sitting around a campfire in blazing saddles, but, maybe he really was worried about the souls of his pupils. I don't know. Either way, in one sense, this passage highlights the duality of service. You can be the one taking orders, which kind of sucks, yeah, but you're up in the front of the ship, and since most of the time the wind is like blowing from that direction, like blowing in your face, you get the sweeter, fresher air first, before the captain, before it's been spoiled by the lungs of your betters, And on the other hand, you could be in the cabin of the ship with the officers making decisions, sniffing and fucking bottling farts for later, like a fucking bootlicking shit, and nobody wants that unless you do. And sucks to suck, fart sniffer. Next. Okay, y'all. Only 3.5 paragraphs to go. To wrap things up, ISHMAEL explains that while in previous instances of this melancholic need to get to sea, he'd gone, as a merchant sailor, this time, however, and for reasons he feels that he had little to no hand in, he fatefully would go as a whaler. And I do mean fatefully. Melville has this, little imagery that he uses of the invisible police officer of the fates who has constant surveillance of me and secretly dogs me and influences me in some unaccountable way, which is just a fucking awesome metaphor for feeling compelled to do something. He basically says that he was swept up in this course of events, but now that he looks back, he can kind of see some of the machinations that were at work behind the scenes, so to speak. He's like, well, the main motivation was the whale itself. And I'm using the royal whale in this sense, the platonic whale, the legendary Leviathan that Melville took all that time to give us all those extracts about. And to encode this idea that whales aren't just creatures of flesh and bone, but are the embodiment of dynamic, overwhelming power, verbs incarnate. He's not talking about Moby-Dick specifically here. He hasn't even heard of him by this point in the narrative, obviously, since he hasn't met Captain Ahab. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Anyway, he's just drawn by the same thing that makes people in stories want to slay a dragon. It's an epic romantic adventure in the quixotic sense, Then there's also the allure of seeing the realm of such a beast, the wild and distant seas where he rolled his island bulk, with all the attending marvels of 1,000 Patagonian sights and sounds helped to sway me to my wish. He's like, yeah, maybe most men wouldn't be attracted to this sort of adventure, but he has this sort of affinity for remoteness and the unknown, true son of the age of exploration. By reason of these things, then, ISHMAEL concludes, the whaling voyage was welcome. The great floodgates of the wonder world swung open, and in the wild conceits that swayed me to my purpose, two and two there floated into my inmost soul endless processions of the whale, and mid most of them all, one grand hooded phantom, like a snow hill in the air. What a beautiful, if confusing, image. And here I think the dividends of reading the etymology and extract section really start to bear out, When he says an endless procession of whales floated 2 by 2 into his inmost soul, he's constructing a metaphor that's so rich, it's hard to sort of like know where to start with the breakdown of it. Like the first illusion that pops out to me, obviously, is the Noah and the Ark one with like the 2 by 2 procession bit. So like maybe in some like microcosmic way, Ishmael's decision to join Ahab and the crew of the Pequod and to hunt down the white whale represents to him some sort of salvation if he's Noah in this analogy, and seems to be like wrangling whales for an ark, you know, in his like inmost soul and his like dreams and his desires. I'm not sure. Not only that, but like each one of those whales can also like represent all of those extracts, like any one of those extracts, or like all of them from earlier, you know, like we've heard all this shit about whales and like how powerful they are and how they just fucking destroy your ship. Like a one whale will destroy your ship and kill the whole crew. And like every one of those whales is just this like, I don't know, like an embodiment of a challenge or some shit like that. It's like an opportunity to separate himself from that poor fucker that's clinched to his desk or nailed to his bench or tied to the fucking counter, right? Maybe he's like, yeah, it's going to sort of suck. I'm going to have to humble myself and follow orders, but I'll end up on the forecastle at least, free from the shackles of the office or the market or the courthouse or wherever the fuck. I'll be breathing fresh air, not fucking sniffing farts in the back with the officers. And I'll be living life, not simply waiting to die. I know I said he wasn't talking about Moby-Dick specifically, but like in that last bit, it does sort of seem to be like foreshadowing him kind of, you know, he's like a snowy mountain in, you know, that's kind of like a little white imagery there, you know? I guess since he's like recollecting the events he's about to relate to us, he's like, it's got him on his mind, you know? So maybe that's why he like singles him out there. Maybe he's even saying that, like, though he hadn't known what it meant at the time, there was always in his heart, you know, some sort of special challenge that was at the core of this whole enterprise. One grand hooded phantom, like a snow hill in the air. And that's how chapter 1, Loomings, ends. And what a cool chapter it was. The whole guided tour bit was so much cooler than I could really do justice without taking like way longer than I already did. The way ISHMAEL establishes that there's like way more to him than meets the eye, so subtly, so deviously. So Costanza, I love it. And I hope you loved it too, Cowpoke, you old horse thief. Remember? From the opening, the whole cowboy talk shtick. It's back. In Pog form. And with that, I will thank you for watching and say goodbye, but not before I invite you to join me next time, dear viewer, for chapter 2 of Moby-Dick, The Carpet Bag.